An old bobcat, one with almost no chance of surviving the bitter cold, appeared one evening just beyond a woman's patio door. He was painfully thin, his movements slow, his strength nearly gone, as if he'd chosen her doorstep as the place to die. Without hesitation, she did something most people wouldn't dare. She set food outside and left the door cracked open. Over time, hunger outweighed fear, and he stepped inside, seeking warmth and safety. Though a wild bobcat isn't meant to live in a human home, this elderly cat seemed more exhausted than dangerous, and once indoors, he surprised her by being calm, quiet, and content. What happens when two souls, both old, both alone, both hiding from the cold, find each other at the very end? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The winter had descended upon the northern ranges of Montana with a brilliance that was almost blinding. It was not the gray, suffocating wool of a typical overcast season, but a sharp, crystal-clear cold that turned the world into a sculpture of ice and light. The sun, hanging low and pale in the vast American sky, cast long, crisp shadows across the snowdrifts that banked against the cedar siding of Martha's farmhouse. Everything was bright. The light bounced off the frozen crust of the snow, magnifying the world outside the glass until it looked like a high-definition photograph. Beautiful, but utterly inhospitable. Martha stood at her patio doors, a mug of black coffee warming her arthritic hands. At 74, she had learned to appreciate the brutality of the season from the other side of double-paned glass. The silence of the house was something she had grown accustomed to in the 5 years since her husband, curious and gentle Henry, had passed. Now the silence was a roommate, one she respected but didn't always like. She was looking at the tree line, watching for the cardinals that usually flitted like drops of blood against the white canvas, when movement caught her eye. It was lower to the ground than a deer, more substantial than a fox. It moved with a disjointed, dragging gait that immediately triggered an alarm in her chest. Martha was no stranger to the wildlife of the Rockies. She had spent decades living on this land, observing the cycles of predator and prey. She knew the fluid, liquid grace of a healthy feline. This was not that. The creature emerged fully from the brush, stumbling into the open expanse of her backyard. The bright morning light hit him, revealing every tragic detail. It was a bobcat, unmistakable by the short, black-tipped tail and the distinct ruffs of fur at the cheeks, though those were now matted and thin. He was large, or at least his frame suggested he had once been a powerful, dominant male. But now he was a ghost draped in tawny fur. His hip bones protruded sharply, creating hollows in his flanks deep enough to hold shadows. He didn't walk so much as wade through the shallow snow, his back legs betraying a weakness that spoke of advanced age and starvation. Martha set her coffee down, the ceramic clicking sharply against the coaster. The rehabber instinct, a dormancy from her younger years volunteering at the County Wildlife Center, flared to life. This wasn't just a hungry animal. This was a creature at the end of its road. A healthy bobcat is elusive, a phantom of the forest that avoids human structures like the plague. For this animal to be here, in the open, in the harsh clarity of day, meant he had exhausted all other options. He was dying. She watched as he collapsed near the base of the old oak tree, just 10 yards from her patio. He didn't curl up to conserve warmth. He simply fell onto his side, his chest heaving with the effort of existing. The bitter wind, cutting across the valley, ruffled his coat, exposing the lack of insulating fat beneath. "Oh, old man," Martha whispered, her voice cracking in the quiet room. "You picked a hard place to rest." The protocol, the strict, unyielding set of rules she had memorized years ago, echoed in her head. Let nature take its course. Do not interfere with adult predators. Safety first. But protocols were written in sterile offices by people who weren't watching a once majestic sovereign of the woods shivering to death in their backyard. The reality of the scene before her, illuminated in that unforgiving, bright winter sun, made the rules feel brittle and cruel. She moved to the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed as she opened it. She bypassed the milk. Cats couldn't process it well, and found a package of raw chicken breasts intended for her own stir-fry that evening. She also grabbed a tin of tuna, packed in water, not oil. It was a meager offering for a wild carnivore, but it was protein, and it was smelly. Scent was the first negotiator. Martha put on her heavy coat, the navy down parka that made her look like a walking duvet, and slipped into her boots. She didn't open the patio door immediately. Instead, she tapped her ring against the glass. The Bobcat didn't even flinch. His ears, usually topped with those signature tufts that acted as antennae for the slightest rustle, remained flat against his skull. He was deaf to the world, or simply too tired to care. She slid the door open. The cold rushed in like a physical blow, biting at her exposed face. She stepped out, the snow crunching loudly under her boots. She moved slowly, telegraphing her presence. She didn't want to startle him into a defensive lunge, though she doubted he had the energy for it. He lifted his head. The movement was agonizingly slow. His eyes, once likely a piercing gold, were clouded with the blue-gray haze of cataracts. He looked at her, then through her. There was no aggression in that gaze, only a profound, weary resignation. He let out a sound, not a growl, not a hiss, but a low, raspy exhale that sounded like dry leaves scraping over stone. "It's okay," she murmured, keeping her voice in a low, monotone register. "I'm not the Reaper, old friend. Not yet." She placed the plate of chicken and tuna on the patio stones, about 5 feet from the door, and backed away. She retreated inside, sliding the door shut but leaving it unlocked. She stood by the glass, a sentinel in the warmth. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The wind whipped snow around the Bobcat's prone form. Martha worried he had already passed, that the food had come too late. But then, the nose twitched. The scent of the tuna, pungent and briny, cut through the sterile cold. He lifted his head again. He dragged himself up, his front legs trembling, his back legs splaying slightly on the ice. It was painful to watch. He was a king brought low by the one enemy no claws could fight. Time. He took a step, then another. He wobbled, nearly falling, but the primal drive to eat, the biological imperative that screams survive even when the body whispers sleep, pushed him forward. He reached the plate. He didn't gulp the food. He didn't have the strength. He licked at the tuna, chewing slowly, his jaw working with visible effort. When the plate was clean, he didn't retreat to the woods. He looked at the glass door. He looked at Martha. And then he did something that stopped her heart for a beat. He stepped forward, pressing his cold, wet nose against the glass, leaving a smudge of steam. He was asking. The dilemma tore at her. A bobcat is a wild animal. Even an old, weak one possesses weapons, teeth and claws designed to tear flesh. To invite him in was to violate every safety standard she knew. It was irrational. It was dangerous. It was absurd. Martha unlocked the door and slid it open 6 inches. "Come on then," she said, stepping back to give him space. "If you're going to die, you don't have to do it in the snow." The bobcat hesitated. The threshold was a barrier between two worlds, the brutal, indifferent wild and the unnatural, terrifying domestic. But the heat radiating from the open crack was a siren song. He pushed his head through, then his shoulders. He dragged his heavy, matted paws over the metal track and stepped onto the beige tile of the sunroom. He brought the smell of the wild with him, a musk of pine needles, old blood, damp earth, and sickness. He stood on the rug, blinking in the stable indoor light. He looked at Martha, then at the empty fireplace, then at the corner of the room where the sun hit the floorboards most directly. He didn't hiss, he didn't spray. He walked, with that heartbreakingly wobbly gait, to the sun-drenched corner. He circled 3 times, an instinct buried deep in his genetic code to trample down grass that wasn't there, and collapsed with a heavy thud. Within seconds, his breathing deepened. He was asleep. Thus began the strange, secret winter of Martha and the old man. She named him Old Man because giving him a pet name like Whiskers or Mittens felt like an insult to his dignity. He was a wild sovereign in exile, seeking asylum. The first week was a lesson in biology and hospice care. Martha knew that refeeding syndrome could kill a starving animal, so she fed him small, frequent meals. She went to the butcher in town, a man named Jim who had known her for 40 years. "Awful lot of chicken hearts and livers, Martha," Jim noted as he wrapped the paper. "Getting a new dog?" "Something like that," she lied smoothly. The deception was necessary. If people knew she had a bobcat in her living room, animal control would be there within the hour. They would euthanize him immediately, for public safety, and to end his suffering. Martha knew the end was coming, but she wanted it to be on his terms, in the warmth, not on a cold steel table surrounded by strangers. The old man was an exemplary houseguest, mostly because he slept 20 hours a day. The energy required to hunt, to patrol territory, to fight off rivals, all of that was gone. His world had shrunk to the sunroom and the kitchen. He was surprisingly clean. Even in his weakened state, he used the makeshift litter box, a large potting tray filled with earth and sand, she had set up in the utility room. It seemed that cats, regardless of size or species, possessed an innate fastidiousness. Martha spent hours observing him. She saw the scars of a life lived hard. One of his ears was notched from an old fight. He had a patch of white fur on his shoulder that looked like a healed burn or abrasion. His teeth, when he yawned, were yellowed and worn down, the canines blunted by years of crunching bone. He was a warrior who had outlived his war. As the weeks passed, the bright, blinding light of early winter began to soften. The days grew marginally longer, but the cold deepened. The old man gained a little weight. His coat, fueled by the steady protein, lost some of its dull, dusty look and regained a hint of its former luster. He wasn't going to recover. His kidneys were failing. She could smell it on his breath, a distinct ammonia tang that no amount of ventilation could cure. But he was comfortable. He began to interact with her. It wasn't the affection of a golden retriever. It was the stoic acceptance of a peer. When she sat in her armchair in the sunroom to read, he would wake up, stretch his long, stiff limbs, and limp over to the rug at her feet. He wouldn't touch her, but he would settle there, his back to her, guarding the room. It was a gesture of profound trust. He was exposing his defenseless spine to her, a predator saying, I know you won't kill me." One evening, a blizzard struck. The wind howled around the farmhouse, rattling the window panes like a thief trying to break in. The electricity flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Martha lit the kerosene lamps and built a fire in the wood stove. The atmosphere shifted from the clinical brightness of the snowy days to a deep, enveloping warmth. The firelight danced on the walls, casting amber shadows. The old man was agitated by the storm. The drop in barometric pressure or the howling wind seemed to trigger old instincts. He paced the room, his claws clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. Click, click, click. He went to the window, staring out into the swirling white void. He let out a low, mournful yowl. "You're safe," Martha said softly from her chair by the fire. "You don't have to be out there tonight." The bobcat turned and looked at her. The firelight reflected in his eyes, turning them into glowing embers. He walked over to her, bolder than he had ever been. He sniffed her knee. Martha froze. This was a 30-pound predator, frail or not. He could take her hand off if he panicked, but he didn't bite. He rubbed his cheek against her shin, a hard, bony bunt of his head. He was marking her. He was claiming her. Then, heavily, he flopped down right on top of her feet. The weight of him was substantial, a solid, anchoring presence. He began to purr. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of a house cat. It was a deep, guttural rumble, like a diesel engine idling underwater. It vibrated through Martha's feet and up her legs. It was the sound of contentment so deep it felt ancient. Tears pricked Martha's eyes. She reached down, her hand trembling slightly, and buried her fingers in the thick fur of his neck. He leaned into the touch, closing his eyes. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" she whispered. Two old relics hiding from the snow. She thought about her own life, the children who called once a month from cities that never slept, the friends who were slowly disappearing into nursing homes or graveyards, the feeling of being invisible, of having society look right through her because she was old and slow. She understood why the bobcat had come to the door. It wasn't just hunger. It was the terrifying solitude of facing the end alone. He had broken the laws of his nature because the fear of dying alone in the cold was greater than the fear of the human. They sat like that for hours, the woman and the wildcat, united by the fire and the storm. February arrived, bringing with it a subtle shift in the light. The harsh glare of noon began to mellow into golden afternoons. The setting inside the house mirrored this shift. The atmosphere became warmer, softer. But as the light warmed, the old man began to fade. The decline was gentle. He started sleeping more, refusing meals. The tuna and chicken livers that used to make him perk up were left untouched. He stopped pacing. He spent his days on the thick wool rug in front of the wood stove, staring into the flames with unfocused eyes. Martha knew the signs. She had seen them in her husband, in her parents, in the dog she had loved over the years. The body was shutting down. The great machinery of life was grinding to a halt. She stopped leaving the house. She moved her bedding to the sofa in the living room to be near him. She kept the fire going day and night, ensuring he never felt a draft. She spoke to him constantly, telling him stories of the valley, of the deer she had seen, of the history of the land he had roamed. She wanted his final sensory inputs to be her voice and the warmth of the fire. "You know," she told him one afternoon as the sun bathed the room in a honey-colored glow, You were probably the terror of this valley in your prime. I bet the rabbits told ghost stories about you." The old man flicked an ear, acknowledging the tone if not the words. On the final day, the change was palpable. His breathing changed, becoming the Cheney-Stokes rhythm she recognized from her nursing days. Periods of rapid breathing followed by long, terrifying pauses. The light in the room was rich and amber, the late afternoon sun filtering through the sheer curtains, turning the dust motes into floating gold. Martha sat on the floor beside him. She didn't worry about safety anymore. She lifted his heavy head and placed it in her lap. He was too weak to lift it himself, but he let out a soft sigh as he settled. His fur was dry, his body incredibly light, as if his spirit were already halfway out. She stroked the velvet fur of his ears, tracing the black tufts. She ran her hand down the ropey muscles of his back, feeling the slow, thumping beat of his heart. "It's okay to go," she whispered, tears finally spilling over and landing on his tawny coat. "You're warm, you're full, you're safe, you did a good job." The old man opened his eyes one last time. The cataracts seemed to clear for a fleeting second, revealing the fierce, wild gold underneath. He looked at her with a clarity that pierced her soul. There was no fear. There was only a quiet acknowledgement of the transaction they had made. His wildness for her mercy. He stretched his legs out, his claws extending and retracting one last time into the wool rug. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then simply stopped. The silence that followed wasn't the empty, lonely silence Martha had lived with for 5 years. It was a holy silence, a stillness that felt full and complete. The fire crackled, a log shifting in the grate, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Martha sat with him until the sun went down, and the room was lit only by the soft glow of the embers. She didn't feel the crushing weight of grief she expected. She felt a profound sense of privilege. She had been chosen. Out of all the houses in the valley, out of all the miles of fence line and forest, the spirit of the wild had chosen her door to close its eyes behind. The next morning, the ground was too frozen to dig a grave. Martha wrapped the old man in her favorite quilt, a patchwork of reds and browns that matched his coat. She placed him in the old wooden chest in the unheated garage, a temporary resting place until the spring thaw would allow her to return him to the earth beneath the oak tree where they had first met. She went back inside and made coffee. She stood at the patio door, looking out at the snow. The world was still bright, still cold, still indifferent. But the house felt different. It felt blessed. Martha took a sip of the hot coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She looked at the empty spot on the rug where the old man had spent his final weeks. She smiled, a sad but peaceful expression settling on her face. "Goodbye, old man," she whispered to the glass. She turned away from the window and walked back into the warmth of her home, carrying the memory of the wild heartbeat she had held in her hands, a secret ember against the winter cold. The isolation of her life remained, but the loneliness was gone, replaced by the enduring warmth of a kindness given and received. She wasn't just an old woman in a big house anymore. She was the keeper of the story, the one who had opened the door when the wild came knocking. And that was enough.